I'm just going to start off really quickly with a demo right away. And hopefully many of you have seen this before. This is Google+, and I'm going to demonstrate the Add to Circles widget for you. Hopefully most of you know how this works. If not, you have this bright red widget here, and you hover your mouse over it. And whoa, that's weird. You hover your mouse over it, and this menu opens, and it looks very strange for some reason. I think it's because of the wireless. There we go. And you hover your mouse over it, and there's checkboxes and the names of your circles, and you can add people to your circles by checking the box. And you know, it works really well. Move your mouse away, it disappears. But now I want you to imagine that you can't see the screen. And you can close your eyes at this part if that helps you imagine. But imagine that you can't see the screen, and you want to add someone to your circles. If you can't see the screen, that means that you can't use a mouse. And if you can't use a mouse, that means that you can't hover over this widget and make the drop-down open up. So to you, you have no way to add someone to your circles. You can't use the mouse. You're only using the keyboard. And effectively, you will never be able to add Vic to your circles if you do it that way. And this is an example of something that we as developers need to make sure that we think about. We need to make sure that our web apps work for everybody, not just someone who can use the mouse or someone that has a certain ability. We need to make sure that our apps work well for everyone. And that's what accessibility is all about. It includes users of assistive technology. It's software or hardware that makes it easier for someone with a particular disability to use the internet. I'm going to talk about some specific types of assistive technology. Blind users will generally use something called a screen reader that describes the page using speech or braille output. Low vision users will either use large fonts or something called a screen magnifier, which makes part of the screen really big. And then users who are motor impaired, maybe they can't use a mouse for some reason. They might use some kind of special keyboard or a voice control interface to control your web app. And there's lots of other users with different disabilities. But the reason that I'm going to talk about these three today is that for these three, we know something very powerful. And that's, we know exactly what assistive technology they're going to use to access our apps. And once we know how they're accessing our apps, we know exactly how to make our apps better for these users. And another thing I want to point out, again, is that all of these three groups of users, none of them may be able to use a mouse. So if you don't remember anything from this presentation at all, the one thing I want you to remember is that you need to make sure your apps work with the keyboard. Don't assume that your users can use a mouse. That is the biggest accessibility problem with websites today. So just remember that one thing if you don't remember anything else. So now that we know what assistive technology we can design our web apps for, how are we going to test our apps? And I have one suggestion for you today, and that's to use a screen reader called Chromevox that my team at Google built. It's essentially a screen reader, and as I said before, it describes the contents of a page. And Chromevox uses speech to describe the contents of any web page. You control it using keyboard shortcuts, and it uses the Chrome text-to-speech API to speak the contents of a page. I don't know how many of you have ever used a screen reader before, but I'm actually going to demonstrate Chromevox to you right now. It's actually been running this entire time. So I'm going to unmute it. Can you hear that?
Introducing Chromevox, heading 3.
So Chromevox talks to you, and I'm going to use the keyboard to control it. So the way a screen reader works is it allows the user to kind of hear both text on the page, just static text, and interactive elements. And so I'm just going to run through this example web form to demonstrate. This form is really boring. Hopefully none of you guys have apps that look just like this, but it's just a demo.
Screen reader introduction, heading 3. Screen readers and magnifiers allow the user to explore both static text and interactive elements.
All I'm doing is I'm using the arrow keys to tell Chromevox where I want it to go on the page.
Here's an example web form to demonstrate. Enter their name, edit text. Choose your favorite color, red, list locked 1 to 10. Submit button. Having trouble? Click here for help link.
So you can see that Chromevox is doing a bunch of different things. It's reading out loud the text on the page, but it's also letting you interact with these controls by playing a sound so that a user who can't see knows what that control is immediately. And it also identifies what kind of control it is to you. So it says button or text field or something like that. So someone can actually use the web without being able to see the screen at all. They just use a screen reader like Chromevox, and it tells them what's on the page. And they control it using the keyboard. So now that you know a little bit about ways that you can test your apps, I'm going to talk about how to actually build these accessible web apps. First, I'm going to talk about the building blocks, what you need to know right away in order to, when you're starting to build an app. And then I'm going to talk about some more complicated things. Maybe you have some really advanced idea that you want to build a really complicated interactive control that's super custom and awesome. And I'll give you some tips on how to make those accessible as well. And then at the end, I'll give you some more tools and resources like Chromevox that will help you when you're building these apps. So starting from the very beginning, building blocks. So most of you hopefully are familiar with the DOM. We're just starting from the very basic here. And something that you might not know is that to a visually impaired user, to a user who can't see, they essentially see only the DOM of your web page. They don't see any of the visual style. They only see the skeleton that you're building your web app from. And users who are using only the keyboard are actually going to navigate your page in DOM order. To them, there's no such thing as left or right. They only see up and down the DOM. And so knowing that, we can actually do some things to make the experience better for these users. The first thing we want to do, and these are all DOM best practices, is to create logical sections of the document. And you can use these sections to identify interface elements that are the same. So, and the HTML5 semantic elements can be really useful here. So if you use a semantic element like nav, that means you can group all of your navigation controls together in one part of the DOM. And that means that a user who's navigating your page using the DOM will be able to find all the navigation controls all in one place. So that can really help them out. Even some old school semantic tags like the H1, H2, H3, those can be really helpful too. So grouping related parts of your interface together is a really good idea. The second thing you want to make sure that you're doing is that parts of controls are also grouped together in the DOM. And I'll see this a lot. I'll see, someone has a drop-down menu button that a user can click on and it opens a menu, kind of like in the circle picker. And they'll have the menu button at one place in the DOM, and they'll have the drop-down menu all the way down at the bottom of the DOM. And you can use CSS to make them look like they're together. But to someone who's seeing only the DOM, they click on that button, and nothing happens, because they're not anywhere near where the rest of the menu is. So to a user who's seeing only the DOM, your menu button and drop-down makes no sense. So if you had grouped that control, that's all one control, together in the DOM, it makes it a lot easier for these users, and it makes it a lot less confusing. And then the final thing, I know this is really basic, but it's really important for these users, is using CSS for layout instead of using tables for layout. To these users, a table is for data, like a spreadsheet. And if you have a web page that's laid out using only tables, these users are going to think that there's data somewhere. They're going to think that there's some kind of spreadsheet involved, and they're going to get really confused also. So it's 2011. Let's use CSS for layout instead of using tables, please. So this is an example just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I say that a user who uses a screen reader or another kind of assistive technology sees only the DOM. And I have a sentence here. It sort of makes sense. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain. And let's hear what Chromevox does when it gets to this sentence.
Example, heading 3. The plain in rain stays mainly in Spain.
So that was all backwards and weird. It was jumping all around that sentence. And that's because the DOM for that sentence actually looks like this. It's all backwards and weird. And so as I said before, this screen reader doesn't pay any attention to how I've used CSS to make this sentence look one way. It's only seeing the DOM. So you can imagine much worse experiences than this, but with the same technique, where the DOM looks totally different than the visual layout of the page. And you have a user that can actually see under the covers. They can see the DOM. So make sure your DOM is nice and clean, just as you want to make sure your page is nice and clean. The second thing I want to talk about is interactive controls. And this is another really basic tip. But instead of using divs and spans to create buttons and links and other kinds of controls, try to use native HTML tags where you can. And this is something that comes in handy right at the beginning, right when you're starting to build a web app. My team at Google likes to call a page that has a lot of divs and spans, div soup or span salad. You see the DOM of a page and it's just div, 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 div all the way down. There's an example here. And there's two reasons for this. The first is that screen readers can't identify generic divs or spans as controls. They don't know what you're trying to do with the span with an on-click handler. to a screen reader, it could be anything. They know it might be interactive, but they don't know if it's a link or a button or some kind of complicated menu that you're building. A screen reader has no way of figuring out what that is. So it means that, therefore, a user has no way of figuring out what that is. And if you had just gone ahead and used a link or a button tag from the very beginning, then a screen reader would know how to identify that to a user. And the second problem with generic divs and spans is that they're not actually focusable by default. You can't use tab to put keyboard focus on them. And that means that you can't use the keyboard to interact with them. And so this is really frustrating for keyboard-only users as well. Maybe they can see the screen, and they can see, a fancy button that you made with a div, but they can't interact with it. They can't click on it. And that's even more frustrating. You see a page with all these buttons and shiny links on it, and you can't actually interact with any of them if you're just using the keyboard. So that's one thing you want to make sure that you do. You want to make sure that wherever you can, you use native HTML tags. And for modern browsers, there's really no reason not to do it. You can style them however you want, and they give you the focus management and keyboard support that I was just talking about for free. You don't have to do anything else. And screen readers know how to identify them, and users know how to interact with them. So I have another demo here. This is a button that I created with a div and an on-click handler. And let's see what Chromevox does when I run over it.
Custom button, lip coding example, heading.
Oops. Uh-oh. Oh, that's wonderful. That's just what I need today. Let's see. I think I'm going to have to just force quit. That's awesome. Yes, I know. I've forced it to quit. Thank you. The good thing is that this is very... oh, that's nice. Well, Chromevox only works on Chrome. So if I use Firefox, here we go. It's right back. OK, let's go. Are you kidding me? Oh my God. OK. I can just tell you what the rest of the presentation is. I mean, it's about accessibility, right? You don't even need to see the screen. You should be able to do this with your eyes closed. So this happens one more time. I'm just going to do it that way. Please, please work. What if I go really slowly? 6. I jump right to 6. It's waiting for Google Analytics. This is, OK, here we go. OK. Let's try this one more time. So it says click on this button, but it just said send, now that you guys are all paying attention again because you're hoping something will go wrong. And something did go wrong. It just said send. There's no indication that this is a button or that you can interact with it. I'm going to press return, and no matter how many times I press it, nothing is happening. And that's because this is a div with an on-click handler. To a screen reader, it's just static text. But there's a really easy way to fix this, and I don't have to restart the browser or anything. All I have to do is just change this to be a button. And you'll see nothing visually changed at all. So let's try this again with Chromevox. So you see that was totally different. It said send, and it made that little noise, and it said button. And if I press return, it actually sends, I can actually interact with it using the keyboard. And that was such a simple change. All I did was change that div to a button. And this is the kind of simple stuff that you can do when you're building your web app. And you don't have to go back later and fix it. You can just do it from the very beginning. And it gives your users a much better experience. They can actually click on the button. And so for these slides, I actually have correct examples after every live example. So at the end of the talk, I'll give you the link to the slides. And you can go online and look at them and actually see the correct examples instead of just the incorrect examples, which would be no good. So now that we're back on track, labeling. Label your controls and images. I can't say this enough. And the label HTML tag is really perfect for this. If you have a form on your website and you have labels for that form, you can use the label tag to explicitly associate each piece of text with the input field. You use it just like I've shown here. You have for and then the ID. And that actually associates first name, the text first name with that input field. So that's really good. And I'll show you in a minute why that's really good. The second thing I want to say, and this is another one of those things where if you forget anything else, please remember this. All images need to have the alt attribute. It's not just some of them. And it's not just the important ones. It's all of them. And the reason why is that if you have an image on your page that doesn't have an alt attribute, a screen reader is still going to try and speak that image. It's going to be really helpful and try to tell the user what that image is. And the way it is really helpful is it actually just speaks the file name of that image, which, as you can imagine, can be really horrible. If you have a file name that's like 30 characters long, a screen reader will helpfully try and say that to the user. And if you have a page with a lot of images on it, that's a terrible experience. Your user is going to leave, and they're never going to come back. So please, all images, give them an alt attribute. If they're important, you want to give it a descriptive alt attribute. So you want to actually write a description of that image. If it's a decorative image, you can give it blank alt text. And blank alt text means a screen reader will just skip it. It won't even speak the image. A user won't even know the image was there. And so, probably for a lot of the decorative images on your website, you want to have blank alt text. So like for bullet points or something like that. But, all of them need to have alt text. If it doesn't have alt text, the screen reader will try and speak it anyway. And it will probably sound a little bit like this. OK, you heard a little bit of it. So this is a form field. I haven't done any of the stuff I just said. These, the names of the fields are positioned using CSS right underneath the field. So you can see what these are. But in the code, they're not associated at all. So we'll see what happens. And also, you'll notice this image doesn't have an alt tag.
Edit text.
So it just said edit text. That's totally not helpful. To a user who can't see the screen, they don't know what they're supposed to put in there.
Edit text.
It's a little bit better, but the label for this is supposed to be PIN, not password.
901 N94T3 image.
So imagine your entire website full of images like that. It's awful. It's the worst thing in the world, and it's the easiest thing to fix it. And so let's also, what I just did is I added alt text to that image tag. And I'm going to change these spans to be label tags. So I'm changing username. I'm changing the span to a label tag. And I'm changing the second span to be also use a label tag. And so let's see what happens.
Password, edit text. Username, edit text.
So you see it's actually reading out loud the label when I'm focused on that input field. So that's a much better user experience for your user.
PIN, password, edit text.
And so now let's see what the image does.
Golden gate.
So that's much better. It's not just an incomprehensible string. It actually tells you what that image is. And for a form like this, where maybe that's a security image or something like that, it's much easier to remember Golden Gate than 901 something something something. So it's really good to do that. The next thing I want to talk about is managing focus. As I said before, keyboard-only users are basically navigating down through your DOM. And the way they're doing that is by moving focus around. You can think of keyboard focus as almost like a cursor for a keyboard-only user. They're moving it down through your DOM as they navigate through the page. So the way we can make things better for them is by actually proactively placing focus on the page. If you think about what the user is trying to do, and if you move focus to help them do that, you're giving your user a really great experience. So for example, if a user is changing tabs or something like that, when they click on the new tab, you can put focus inside that new tab pane. And so that actually helps them do what they're trying to do. And another thing to remember is that when they're finished doing that, when they've closed that tab, you want to put focus back where it was. Don't just drop it on the floor. And I'll show you why that's a bad idea. So this is another example. This is a pop-up dialog. And I see a lot of dialogues just like this. So let's just do it with Chromevox right now.
Pop-up dialog, lib coding example, heading 3. Buy more printer ink button.
OK, so a bunch of different things happen here. A dialog opened up, and the rest of the page went gray. And so visually, this is a modal dialogue. You're supposed to interact with this dialogue before you do anything on the rest of the page. You know, this dialogue's covering up the button and the rest of it is gray. You know visually that you're supposed to do something. But to a user who can't see the screen, or a user who can see the screen but is just using the keyboard, focus is still behind that dialogue. They're still in the page. And if you can't see the screen, they have no idea that a dialogue just opened up. They press that button, and to them, nothing happened. And so this is a terrible experience for this user. And if they're trying to navigate around the page to find the dialogue, you can see it went to the refresh button. It's going actually behind the dialogue. So even though you colored the rest of the page gray, it's not like you made the rest of the page not interactive. The user is still kind of messing around behind your dialogue, and they might never find it. I actually positioned this dialogue in the DOM above the button, so a user would have to go around the entire page in order to get up to that dialogue again. But I'm going to cheat because I know where it is. So I just jumped back into the dialogue. And so, somehow maybe your user got into the dialogue by accident, and they're going to close it. I'm going to press cancel. And so you can see the dialogue went away, but focus was just dropped on the floor. There's no purple outline on this page anywhere. I'm not focused on anything. If this was a longer page, I would have focus right back at the top of the screen. So you can imagine if you have a button down at the bottom that opens a dialogue. When that dialogue closes and that user is dropped at the top of the screen, they're going to hate you. So don't make your users hate you. Be smarter about focus. And this, again, is really easy to fix. The first thing you want to do when the dialogue opens is put focus inside the dialogue. Help your user out. You want them to interact with the dialogue, so you can put focus inside of there to help them. So I'm just going to do that right now. Let's see, what's that button called? OK. So I'm going to use the focus method to put focus on that. And then, when the dialogue closes, I want to put focus back on the button. I want to drop the user right back where they started. So let's see what this is like. So you see that's great. The focus actually drops right into the dialogue, and the user is now ready to interact with the dialogue however you want. And if I close the dialogue, focus goes right back onto the button. And that's a much better experience. And the only things I changed was just putting focus proactively around the page. And it was so easy to do that. And so this is just a really good thing that you can do to help your users out. Don't leave them lost at the top of the DOM trying to wander back to where they were before. And the last thing I want to talk about in this section is keyboard shortcuts. There's two major kinds of keyboard shortcuts. And this is something that you've probably had experience with before. Navigation shortcuts you can use to jump between major interactive areas of your page. So how many of you have used the J and K keyboard shortcuts in Gmail to move between messages? Oh, cool, like 5, 7 people. That's awesome. For the rest of you, you can use J and K to move between the messages in Gmail. So you're learning something new at every talk. And this is a great way to prevent your user, protect your user from having to do a bunch of tabbing to go between messages. And it actually helps you, at least with Gmail, it helps you segment the UI into logical units. Gmail is essentially a collection of messages. J and K will allow you to move between those messages. And so for someone who uses only the keyboard, this is a really great innovation because you don't have to tab around a bunch of times to get to every message. The other kind of shortcut is an action shortcut. And what an action shortcut does is it makes a workflow or an action easier to do. So in Gmail, one example of this is you can press C to start composing a new message. How many of you knew about that? Oh, you did. You're very enthusiastic about that. So the rest of you, you can press C to compose a new message. And that's an example of an action shortcut. It makes it a lot simpler to start writing a new message. You don't have to hunt for the button. You don't have to press tab a million times. You can just press C, and the new message pane opens up, and you can start using it. And so this is actually just simplifying a workflow. It's making it easier for your users. And the thing about keyboard shortcuts is they're not just a good idea if you're thinking about users who have disabilities. They're a good idea for everyone. Power users really benefit from keyboard shortcuts. Users who know your application really well and just want to use it faster, keyboard shortcuts are a great way to help those users. But the thing is, and you might have seen this with my Gmail example, you need to make sure that your shortcuts are well documented. Because it doesn't help if only 5 of your users know that you have keyboard shortcuts. So you really need to make sure that you're documenting them well, and maybe we need to do a better job. But for now, you guys all know, so maybe it's OK. So now that we've covered the basics, let's move on to the next steps. Let's go to kind of a little bit more advanced discussion. So maybe you're working with someone else's code, or you already wrote your web app. Or maybe you have like some really complicated control you want to build, like the Add to Circles widget. And so you end up with div soup. And it's OK. I told you it was bad, but it's OK. And you don't have to panic or cry or anything. It's fine, because I can show you how to fix it. And it's actually really easy. All you have to do is think about a native control that you want to kind of mimic, a native control that you want your custom control to act like. And then you just want to make sure that your custom control acts just like that native control. It kind of makes it easier for your users to know what to expect. And the two ways you do that are with focus management and keyboard support. And you also want to make sure you have an extra layer on top for screen readers. I told you earlier that screen readers have a lot of problems with divs and spans. So we can add extra markup called aria to make it easier for screen readers to understand what's going on. So this is an example of the Add to Circles widget. It's basically div soup. It doesn't even fit all on the screen. So, and I actually simplified it. The actual div soup for the Add to Circles widget wouldn't even fit in this presentation. But you can see here, this top div is the widget itself, this big red button-looking thing. And then we have the Add to Circles dropdown here. That's just essentially a bunch of divs. But it's OK. We can make this accessible, even though it's div soup, and just by following a few simple steps. The first thing you want to do, again, is thinking about focus. And I said before that divs and spans aren't focusable by default. But you can make them focusable. And that's by using the tab index attribute. And for those of you who have never seen the tab index attribute before, I have a quick rundown here of how it works. But essentially, by saying tab index equals 0 on these divs and spans, you can actually make them keyboard focusable. So your user who's using tab to move around the page can then put focus on that div. And that allows them to interact with it using the keyboard. So this is really important to do. You can do everything else in this presentation right, but if your divs and spans aren't focusable, your users aren't going to be able to interact with them. So tab index is really important. And then again, you want to make sure you're proactively placing focus around the page to make sure, within your control itself, you're actually giving the user a better way to, implement or, follow their particular workflow. You also want to show the keyboard love. You want to make sure that your custom controls can be controlled by keys like enter and space and arrows. If you think about a native control that you see, like maybe a native HTML control, or even like a native control on your desktop, you can use the arrow keys and enter and things like that to interact with it. So you want to make sure your custom control can do that too. And the easiest way is just to pick a native control and mimic it. Maybe there's some kind of cool tab interface on your desktop that uses arrow keys. You can make your custom control work like that too. And the W3C actually has a really good guide to common keyboard patterns that you'll see. So if you look at these slides at home, you can click on this link and go to the W3 site. And they have a whole list of what users will expect when they get to a custom control, like a tab panel or a list box, what the arrow key should do, stuff like that. So this is a really good guide. I look at it all the time. And it's just, it's what your users will expect. And this is an example of how you want to listen to keyboard events like enter and space for those of you who might not know how that works. So back to the Add to Circles widget. What we're doing here is we're picking a native control and then mimicking it. So if you think about the Add to Circles widget, it's kind of acting like a button. I know that I showed you can hover over it and make the dropdown appear. But to someone that can't use the mouse, really it's just a big red thing on the page that they need to do something to in order for a dropdown to appear. So that's really most like a button when you think about it. So all we need to do is just mimic the way a button works. And so obviously the first thing you want to do is make sure that it's keyboard focusable. And I did that by adding tab index to the div. And then you also want to allow keydown events like enter and space to activate the button and show the dropdown. And you can do this in addition to the hover event that I already demonstrated. You can also listen for enter and space on this button to open the dropdown. And so that's exactly mimicking what a button would do. Any native button on a page, you could press enter or space to interact with it. The Add to Circles dropdown is a little bit more complicated. But if you think about it, it's kind of most like a dialogue. You hover over that widget, and then the drop-down appears. But when you move away from the widget, the drop-down disappears. So you're really, they're forcing you to interact with that drop-down. And that's kind of the way a modal dialogue behaves. And to a user who can't see the screen, they don't know that there's some fancy, opening animation from the widget. All they know is that now there's a new pane on the page they have to interact with. So we can call it a dialogue. And like in the example I did before, there's certain things that users expect from dialogues. You want to put focus on the first focusable element in this menu. In this particular one, it would be the checkbox. And you want to trap focus inside the dialogue. You want to make sure that the user can't fall out of this dialogue accidentally. Because then they'll be like lost in the Google Plus page, and they won't be able to find it again. So you can actually make sure that the user will never be able to tab out of this dialogue. But then you also want to add a keyboard shortcut to close the dialogue. Because if you're trapping the user, you still want to make sure they can get out of it somehow. And for most dialogues, escape will close it. So I added escape to this one. And then, again, really important, when the dialogue closes, when the user closes the dialogue, you want to put focus back on the Add to Circles button. Because otherwise, focus just gets dropped on the floor. The user is stuck at the top of the Google Plus page, and they have to go down all the way down to the Add to Circles widget. So just putting focus back on the button is something that you can really help your users out. And so the next thing that you want to think about, focus and keyboard support are really good for keyboard-only users. But screen reader users need an extra layer on top, and that layer on top is called ARIA. Basically, ARIA attributes just give screen reader users extra information. They give information that's normally just conveyed visually. Like the Add to Circles widget looks like a button. But we need to tell screen readers that it actually is a button. And just a note here that you still need to do everything else first. ARIA is kind of like the extra layer on top. You can't just do ARIA and call it a day. So there's two basic types of ARIA attributes. There's the ARIA role attribute, and you use that to indicate what this div or span is supposed to be. In this example, I used role equals button. So this div now is a send button. And you'll see I also put tab index here, because without tab index, ARIA makes no sense. A screen reader will know that it's a button, but because it's not keyboard focusable, a user will have no way to interact with it. So tab index first, then ARIA, and now this is a button. And roles also, you can do them to indicate kind of more complicated composite controls, like menu item. There's no native HTML equivalent for menu item, but you can still use ARIA to indicate that this div is one of many menu items, maybe in a bigger menu. So this is what you can use this role for. And there's lots of other kinds of roles. On the W3C website, they have a whole list of all the different kinds of roles you can pick from. It's also a really good resource to look at when you're at home. And then there's another kind of role called landmark roles. And these are really important. You can use these just like the native HTML semantic elements I talked about before, like nav and header. There's extra ones that are just for ARIA. So role equals search. You can put all of your search functionality inside this landmark role section. And that means that a screen reader user can actually search for the search part of your page, or they can search for the header part of your page, and they'll be able to go straight there. They won't have to tab around the page forever. They can actually jump around your page if you use the landmark roles. So this really helps your users out. They can become much faster about jumping between parts of your app. And the second type of ARIA attribute is a state, also called a property. You can use ARIA states to add dynamic information. So maybe you have a role equals checkbox in your app somewhere. You're saying that this div is actually a checkbox. Checkboxes have a state. You can update them to be checked or unchecked. So there's ARIA states that will allow you to give that information to the screen reader. This one is called ARIA-checked. So you can set it in the HTML. Maybe this checkbox by default is checked. And in your JavaScript, you would go and update this state as the checkbox gets checked or unchecked. And there's lots of ARIA states that you can add to your divs and spans to update the screen reader. There's a more complicated ARIA property that's called ARIA Live. And I wish I had more time to go into it, but I'll save it for a 201 talk. This is more of an introductory talk. But ARIA Live you can use to identify dynamic content. And I'm sure that most of the web apps you guys are dreaming about building have some kind of dynamic content that changes without the user refreshing the page. I mean, that's kind of like what Web 2.0 is about. You don't have to refresh the page to get updates from the server. But screen readers have a really hard time figuring out what parts of the page are updated. They don't know what divs or spans are actually live. They don't know that they're receiving updates. So you can use the ARIA property aria-live to actually indicate to a screen reader, watch this div. It's going to get updates, and I want you to speak them to the user. And so this is a really powerful property. It kind of it's indicating to a screen reader what parts of the page it should pay attention to. And there's a lot more information on this property, and again, I've linked to the W3C. So you can look at it and figure out all the different kinds of ARIA-live properties you can use. But they're really, really powerful, and they can be really helpful to your users, especially in combination with the landmark rules. So back to the Add to Circles widget. This widget is a div, and to a screen reader, it's not going to know how to identify it to a user unless we put role equals button. So we have tab index and role equals button on this div. And now when a screen reader gets to the Add to Circles widget, it will say button. Then we also have the dialog. Before we talked about how this is acting like a dialog, but we should actually just say that it's a dialog. And we can do that with role equals dialog. So when you put focus inside this dialog, a screen reader will actually announce that you've jumped into a dialog, which is really awesome. And then we have these divs that we're using as checkboxes. So again, we want to specify that they are actually checkboxes to the screen reader. And this is the part where I do a demo of the Add to Circles widget working, but I don't think that my wireless will let me get there. Let's try it, and I'll do the rest of the talk. Oh, well, that was really suspiciously fast. Maybe everybody watch right here. The rest of this page loads, but that doesn't. I don't even. Oh, there we go. OK. OK. So you see it says button. We're focused on the button. There's a little white outline around it, and it says button. So that indicates to me, as a screen reader user, that I can interact with this. Wow, that's really transparent. So you don't need to see it. You're screen reader users. You have ears. For those of you who didn't hear it, it said checkbox friends, 0, entering dialog. So that tells the user a lot of different things. That they're on a checkbox. The label of the checkbox is friends, 0. That they're inside this dialog. So they can check this box if they want. Oh, it's back. So the screen reader, Chromebox, did a lot of different things right there. I checked it using the spacebar, and it announced friends checked. And so that tells the user, it updates them on what they did, and it tells them that they're still on the checkbox. So you see I'm just navigating around this dialog by using tab. So I'm just going to say that Vic and I are friends just by checking that box. Now we're best friends. That's how it works, right? Now we're friends. So you can just go all the way around. And I'm going to show you how you're trapped inside. I'm going to go all the way up to the top. Now, there's no focus ring there, but you can see it actually wrapped around the dialog. So as the user, I can't accidentally fall out of this dialog and end up on the page somewhere and not know whether or not Vic and I are friends. I have to stay inside this dialog until I decide to leave. And I'm going to do that by pressing escape. So you can see Chromebox was really helpful. It said I exited the dialog, and now I'm on this friends button, which is right where I started. So this widget, which was totally inaccessible if you can't use the mouse, works really well if you use a screen reader. And one important thing to remember is that I did all of those changes without affecting the visual look of this widget at all. And that's something I want you guys to really consider. That accessibility changes, you can make them and make the web a better experience for your users without changing or sacrificing your visual look. And that's something that wasn't possible 5 or 6 years ago. But it's possible now. You can give both types of users a really great experience. And that's what we have with the Add to Circles widget today. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit more about giving you a recap of what I just talked about. So these are the things that you want to have in your accessible web apps. You want to make sure that your DOM is structured sensibly. The skeleton of your web app makes sense to a user who's only seeing that skeleton. You want to make sure you're avoiding div soup wherever you can, that you're using native HTML tags wherever possible. And this will actually save you a lot of work later on. You want to make sure all your controls and images are labeled, especially your images. Remember, they all need to have alt tags. So go home right now and fix that, because it's definitely bothering your users if they don't have alt tags. You want to make sure that you've got good focus management. You want to make sure that your app can be used entirely with the keyboard. I'm just assigning you things to do when you go home. But the first thing you should do when you go home is fix your images. And the second thing you should do is unplug your keyboard and unplug your mouse and try your app. Because using an app with just the keyboard is a really great way to figure out exactly what's wrong and help you figure out how to help your users. And you also want to make sure you have that extra layer on top. You want to make sure that you have ARIA for screen reader users, that your divs and spans are identified to screen readers as links and buttons or whatever else you've decided that they should be. And then you want to make sure that your custom controls are also following this advice. Your entire app should follow this advice, but especially custom controls. And I gave you a bunch of tips to help you do that. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some tools and resources that will help you do this. The first one, obviously, I'm going to plug Chromevox again. It's an extension for Chrome. So you can install it. It works on every platform that you have Chrome on. And it's actually built into Chrome OS. So if you have a Chromebook and you press, I think it's Control-Alt-Z when you turn it on, it will start talking right away. So Chromevox is the screen reader that we really think is good for the web. We built it for the web, and we really see it as a good solution for developers and users. Chrome Shades is something that I wish I had more time to talk about, but it's essentially a visual accessibility testing extension. So it will reformat your page as text only to kind of give you an idea of what screen reader users are hearing. And you can get both of these from our Google Code site, Google Access Chrome. You can install both Chromevox and Chrome Shades and try them out and try your apps on them. And there's some other no-cost screen readers out there if you want to try different ones. VoiceOver actually comes on every Mac. It's free, so if you have a Mac, you can try that out. And NVDA is an open source screen reader that is really popular as well. Oh, I forgot to mention, Chromevox and Chrome Shades are also both open source. So if you want to contribute to a project, I suggest coming to talk to me afterwards. There's also libraries that have good accessibility support. And these are just some of them. There are more. But Dojo and GWT and jQuery all have accessibility support built in. So if you're using those libraries, you might have accessibility without having to do some of the extra things I talked about in this, that I just talked about. I'm sure there are others out there. So now some final thoughts, so I have time for questions. Whether you're actually just building an app from scratch, from the very beginning, or you're working on refining a widget that someone else gave you, you're working on code that someone else wrote, or you're working on something that is really complex and interesting, you can still make it accessible. You can make it really interesting for your users to use. And the first step in this journey, you don't have to download anything. You don't have to have any special tools. Just unplug your mouse and try your app. And I guarantee you'll find something interesting. And then, to get you the rest of the way there, there's HTML5 standards like ARIA and the tips that I just gave you that will help you get the rest of the way there to help make your app work for everybody, not just some users, but for everybody that wants to use it. And that's a really good thing to do. And this is all the resources for this talk. Again, you can get the code for this HTML5 presentation on Google Access Chrome. We have a discussion list if you're interested in using Chromevox and talking to others. And Google also has an accessibility site that has more tips for developers, like if you're an Android developer or something like that. Google.com/accessibility. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you